Muito boa tarde e sejam bem-vindos a mais um live event da IT Security, desta vez com o apoio da Sophos. O meu nome é Rui Damião e sou o diretor da IT Security. Todos sabemos que a cibersegurança é essencial nos processos de transformação digital de todas as organizações. A dependência de tecnologia do mundo atual traz riscos, mas não podemos simplesmente deixar de utilizar tecnologia. Temos de a proteger para que os negócios não parem. Do lado de quem ataca, as inovações vão aparecendo e o objetivo é o mesmo de sempre, criar o maior dano possível às organizações para que paguem os resgates pedidos. Por exemplo, as empresas de cibersegurança, como a Sophos, vão evoluindo os seus produtos para fazer frente à realidade de cibersegurança atual. Apesar das inovações dos produtos de cibersegurança, é importante saber também como é que os adversários estão a evoluir para que as organizações se possam melhor preparar para as ciberameaças que vão ter de enfrentar. Neste webinar, vamos contar com a apresentação do Adversary Report, um conjunto de relatórios da Sophos que analisa a forma como quem ataca e quem defende está a modificar as suas técnicas para fazer frente ao outro lado, com a presença de John Shier, Field CTO da Sophos, assim como um pequeno debate depois desta apresentação com Bernardete Carvalho, Territory Account Manager da Sophos, e Marcelo Viegas, Head of IT Infrastructure and Cybersecurity na International Iberian Nanotechnology Laboratory. Antes deste pequeno debate que acabei de referir, vamos então ouvir John Shier. John, welcome to this live event. The floor is yours.
Obrigado, Rui, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. As I start to share my screen here, I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do today. So I'm going to be presenting some data from the active adversary reports that we've published both last year, so there were 3 last year, as well as some from the upcoming active adversary report, which is due out in a month. So I'll be giving you guys a preview of this. Nobody's seen this data yet except me. So we're going to dig into a little bit of the differences between last year and this year. And then we're also going to be looking at some of the threat report statistics. There aren't many, but that's due out in a week from now. So I believe it's Tuesday we're going to be publishing that report. So look for that, which is going to be a report that's going to look at the differences between what we call cybercrime on Main Street versus Wall Street, right? The big guys versus the small guys, and how most of cybercrime is impacting smaller businesses and what they can do about it. So let's start off by looking at the attack types between this past year in 2023 and the previous year. And what I really want to highlight here is the fact that we've reached sort of a stabilization point with respect to attack types. You can see ransomware has been pretty stable over the last few years, as have network breaches. And many of the other types as well, things like web shells and loaders and DDoS attacks and coin miners. One notable exception to that is that the data extortion side of things is growing. And this is something we expected to see for a little while because it's much less noisy and much less obvious to just steal data and then ask for payment later than it is to launch full-on ransomware where you encrypt everything. And we're starting to see that in the data. Now, one thing that is to bear in mind is when I'm talking about a lot of this data, this is incident response data. This is people who called Sophos asking for help to remediate an ongoing attack. And so it is no surprise that ransomware is very high on this list. But what we're also seeing, its first appearance, at least in our data, is business email compromises, BECs. Now, it looks like it's pretty low. We only had 1 case in 2023, and we didn't have any the prior year. But what we do see in terms of BEC is that on our managed detection and response side of things, the MDR business, we see a lot of BEC. So I believe it's something like 50x the difference between the IR and the MDR. So that's something to bear in mind when we're talking about statistics, is the context under which these statistics are being gathered. Next, we want to look at what I call root causes. So the MITRE attack framework, which is simply a way of describing different phases of an attack, talks about something called initial access, right? How did the bad guys get in? And root causes are, why did that work? And if we look at the first couple columns here, the first couple years in this graphic, we see that for 21 and 22, exploiting a vulnerability was very common, followed by the compromised credentials or stolen credentials. But then in 2023, something dramatic happened, and that was over 55% of all attacks were relying on compromised credentials. Now, that's not to say that exploits are, the thing of the past. We've seen quite a few exploits recently that have generated a lot of media attention. And I think that maybe in the first 2 years of this particular data set, there were things like proxy shell and log4j that might have obscured the reality, which is compromised credentials are a huge problem. And they've been going on for a long time. But when you have these easy to exploit vulnerabilities that are everywhere, it might balance things out a little bit more. And that's evidence if we look at the all-time stats on the far right, where compromised credentials and exploiting a vulnerability are pretty much even. Now, that some of the reasons for that is criminals will just take the path of least resistance. Whatever works today and is easiest for them to accomplish their goals, they'll use. And pretty much exploiting a vulnerability and compromised credentials are two of those that get used interchangeably. What's really worrying, however, about the compromised credentials statistic is that in 43% of cases where compromised credentials were used, there was no multi-factor authentication at all. So a simple little technological change that could have prevented a lot of these attacks just wasn't available. Now let's compare that to some of the threat report findings that you'll see next week, which is in terms of detection. So remember, this is incident response data, which is what I'm showing you on the screen. But in terms of just overall detections from our entire customer base, what's more common are things like info stealers, spywares, keyloggers at 43%. So nearly half of all the detections that get blocked are because of people trying to get things like credentials, right? Info stealers, keyloggers. And then the next biggest segment at nearly a third is droppers, right? So these are this is malware that when it gets on your system will then drop an additional payload, and we often see those coupled with things like remote access Trojans that provide access, which then gets sold on to cyber criminals that will do ransomware at the end. So all of these things seemingly fit together really well. And I hope you read the threat report to get some more details on that. So let's talk about dwell time. Dwell time is the time between when an attacker first gets into your network and then when they are detected. Now, detected could be a couple different things. For ransomware, we treat detected as when the ransomware payload, the binary itself, was launched on the network. So the encryption started, and often the ransom note pops up on the server. For all other attack types, it's a little bit less clear, right? We have customer testimonials. So they say, we noticed something happened on this date, or we can then ascertain or determine through some of the data we look at in the logs when the attack was detected. But that dwell time is the time between those two events. And then what I call the earliest IOC are any events that happen before the start of the attack. Now, the start of the attack, it's a little bit art sometimes to determine when that occurred, because sometimes there are events that are linked to that attack, but we can't actually link them together in the data. And if we look at the overall dwell time, so the median value of all dwell time was 6 days in 2023, so for the 2024 report. And the earliest IOC was a median of 50 days, 50 days. So that's a long time for somebody to be in your network. The maximum was 1,072 days. That is staggering. And there were a few others that were in the couple of years range as well. So some criminals are getting into these networks, staying for a long time, and then selling on that access to others, which is why some of these earliest IOC dwell times are very, very long. Now, if we pull back a little bit and look at a few years worth of data to see, has there been any change? Well, we can see that throughout the years, dwell time has been falling across all the different categories, whether it's the averages, the mean, right, or the median. We can see even the maximum dwell times are shrinking. And the standard deviation, which measures how far away from the average you are, has also been shrinking, meaning that the overall data set is coming closer to the average, meaning that attacks are indeed getting faster. If we focus specifically on ransomware, because ransomware is one of those threats where there are clearer boundaries to when attacks start and when attacks finish or when they get detected. What's worrying here is we're seeing a crashing of dwell time, as you can see, from 2020 all the way down to 2023 to 5 days. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. I think one is that we are getting better at detecting. So the faster we detect, the more, as in the industry talks about shifting left, right? Getting closer to that initial access point of detection. The smaller the dwell time is going to be. But also, the cyber criminals know this. They know that we're getting better at detection. They know they have to move faster, and they are. Ransomware turned 10 years old on September of 2023, since the CryptoLocker days, which is the modern crypto ransomware. And in those 10 years, the ransomware criminals have learned a lot about how to pull off an attack, and they've had a lot of practice. And so they say practice makes perfect, and we can see in some of this data that it is being put into, the data shows that they are getting better at what they do, as are we. So it's kind of a good news, bad news kind of scenario. But also, we know that ransomware is noisy. Ransomware requires more privilege escalation. It requires bringing in additional files and payloads onto the system, onto the network, whereas data exfiltration isn't as noisy. And so for that reason, ransomware criminals do have to move faster as well, because you want to be able to get to the encryption before you actually are detected. Looking at timelines, looking at dwell time had me thinking about other metrics, other measures that we could look at with respect to how fast the criminals are moving and the types of things they're doing. So I looked specifically at Active Directory, at the time to Active Directory, how long from the start of the attack to getting to Active Directory that the criminals take. And in 2023, that was 0.64 days, or around 15 hours. So cyber criminals, once they get into the network, one of the first stops they make or attempt to make is to go after Active Directory. Now, what's interesting, if we look at both the minimums and the maximums, is that the maximum was 281 days. So in those, I think that the data wasn't very clear in terms of who was doing what. So the actual criminal that went after Active Directory might have been different than the one who initially breached, but they were around the network for a very long time. The most interesting stat with respect to that is the minimum of minus 28 days, which you may say, well, how can something be minus? Well, when we look at our data and we see that the start of the attack, where we're pretty sure this is the criminal that actually eventually launched the ransomware at the end, well, if it happens before that, it means somebody else was in there, or they were in there before the actual start of the attack. And that's usually what we call IABs, initial access brokers. And so minus 28 days means in less than a month before the start of the attack, somebody else came in. And the reason they came in often for these negative numbers is that Active Directory was exposed to the internet. And this happens not a lot, but it happens enough that cyber criminals are able to take advantage of that. Now, in 90% of cases, the Active Directory server version, the operating system version, was server 2019 or earlier. And in 2023, we saw that was 98%. Now, the good news about that is, whether you agree with this statement or not, Microsoft does get better at security over time. As they release newer versions of Active Directory, they get rid of unsafe protocols, they get rid of obviously vulnerabilities. And so it does make this platform safer over time. And as earlier versions are retired, that's why we're seeing that number go down. So that's a good thing. And we're also seeing more Azure AD or Entra AD is starting to appear in the data set. Now, I looked at this for 2023, and I wanted to see, well, how does that match up with 22? And I didn't gather the data in 22. So I went back and relooked at all of the data for 2022 to see what the average was, or the sort of the median time was. And it was 1.34 days in 2022. So over the course of a year, the adversaries sped up quite a bit to get to Active Directory. One reason for that is it's the most powerful asset on most networks. You can use it to escalate privilege. You can use it to move laterally. You can use it to change policies, even deploy the ransomware from Active Directory. So it's no wonder that the criminals are taking no time to get to Active Directory. I also wanted to look at when the ransomware was launched. And in this case, we defined business hours as 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. in local time. And what we found was, looking at when the ransomware payloads were deployed, 90% was done after hours. As a matter of fact, 56% was done between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. It's really starting to point a finger at what some of the attackers think about our ability to detect. They go after Active Directory because it's privileged, powerful, and it's chronically underprotected. They strike during these off hours because we're less likely to be watching, and they do all this very quickly because in case you have tools and services that are in place to detect them. If we expand this data set for all attacks for 2022 and 2023, the statistic holds. 91% of all attacks in nearly 200 attacks across these 2 years occurred after business hours. Now, we also have missing telemetry that comes into play here. In addition to moving very quickly, we see that the attackers are often trying to blind us. So they clear the logs, or try to erase their tracks in 39% of the time, and they disable protection in 43% of the time. But we're also blinding ourselves, because in 24% of the time, the logs were simply unavailable for our incident responders to determine what happened. Now, for those of you who are keen-eyed, you'll see that this is missing telemetry for the first half of 2023. And when I published my report in November, this is what we had to work with. I've since done the analysis on all of 2023, thinking that, the data would probably hold. Unfortunately, if this doesn't look good, it actually gets worse. Here we see that logs being unavailable were present in 54% of all the cases we investigated. So now we're left with not knowing whether data was exfiltrated. We're left with not understanding what the root causes and potentially how the criminals got in. And so we can't determine, or we can't give advice on how to protect the network. So when logs are unavailable, that's pretty bad. But also we've seen a slight increase in disabling protection, and the logs that are being cleared have decreased, maybe because they've seen, well, you're not gathering logs anyways, we don't need to clear them. So I said earlier that ransomware dwell time was down to 5 days for 2023. And in the middle of last year, I saw a blog post by Microsoft talking about a 5-day job with Blackbyte, one of the ransomware groups that are out there today. And it got me thinking about, well, is there something interesting about 5 days? So using that as a separator, I looked at the data from the past 18 months. So that's from the start of 2022 to the middle of 2023. Just to understand how many attacks of any kind fit in that window. So whether it's ransomware or network breaches or data exfiltration. And out of the 232 cases that were involved here in that period, 85 of those cases, or 38%, fit the dwell time of 5 days or less. Now, if we look at the distribution of all those 5 days, and we look at and we split the 85 cases between, we look at the distribution, we can see it's definitely declining, right? So there are more cases that are happening in fewer days than there are in the 4 or 5 day trend. And if we split those cases between 22 and the first half of 2023, we're seeing that there's actually an increase in the period covering 2023. And that lines up pretty well with the declining dwell times that we've seen in the last couple data periods. Now, if we pull back a little bit and we look at all the attacks and see, well, where do they all line up in terms of the minimum to the maximum? You can see the maximum in this case was 960 days of dwell time. Fully 50% of the entire data set fits into 9 days or less. So it would appear that the fast attacks are the norm, are the most prevalent thing. But is there any meaningful difference in those demographics or the tools that get used in these fast attacks? And to understand that, I split the cases into 2 groups. The fast group, which happens in 5 days or less, and the slow group that took more than 5 days. So we're going to look at some of the data that we had earlier in the presentation, and we're going to map that onto this new metric of 5 days or less and greater than 5 days to see if there are any differences, to see if we can learn something here. And first, we're going to look at attack types. And in all these graphs, the left side will be 5 days or less, and the right side will be 5 days or greater than 5 days. And obviously, ransomware is still the most prevalent type of attack, as are network breaches. Regardless of speed, they seem to be fairly static across all different ways that we can measure these things. And the same thing can be observed for things like web shells and loaders as well. They're pretty much around half and half. Data extortion attacks and data exfiltration seem to be occurring in the longer attacks. And if you're not doing a lot of noisy things, as ransomware criminals do, maybe you can be slower. And if extortion, which is the I steal data and then demand payment, versus exfiltration, which is just stealing data, if that's your only pressure tactic, if there's no encryption, for example, you're going to want to get all the data possible. You're going to take your time. You're going to be quiet. So and then for coin miners, obviously crypto miners, they're meant to stay on a server for a very long time. So it's no surprise that these are taking longer. So this is pretty much, I think, exactly how we would have, if we were to guess ahead of time, if we were to hypothesize ahead of time how this would look, I think this chart is very much in line with our with what our guesses would be. If we turn our attention to root causes, so it's which ones are more closely associated with either fast or slow, we see a greater distribution. For example, compromised credentials. We saw went bananas in 2023, have a slight prevalence in particular here, but that's because because they were more in 2023, they're showing up more in this data. The unknown category, though, is something that I think is a really big problem, because back to missing telemetry, back to not knowing what happened, regardless of whether it's fast or slow, 50% thereabouts of all attacks on either side have an unknown to them. And that means that we can't learn from this attack. We can't know what to patch and what services to take off the internet that are being exposed, perhaps accidentally. We can't know the types of things that might lead to a second or a third attack by cyber criminals down the road. And that's a really big problem. And then the notable outlier here, I think, is the supply chain compromises, of which we're seeing a lot more these days. And supply chain compromises, for this specific data set, I think makes a bit of sense. The initial attack usually is a lot slower, but once you've got into your foot in the door of the supplier, the subsequent attacks are much faster. And we've seen that in some cases where the first attack will occur over a matter of weeks, and then the following attacks will occur over a matter of days, if not hours. Now let's look at the tools that are being used, and this is we're going to look at the tools, what we call the lol bins or the Microsoft binaries, and the techniques that are being used. And this is where we start seeing a lot more grouping in terms of the separation between the two. And this is going to compare the top 5 results of each category. Now, you probably can see on the screen here, there's more than 5 results. That's because the 5th result in one or the other was actually lower down. So in order to include everything, we've included the top 5 for both. In the 226 cases in this data set, there was at least, where at least one artifact or tool was used. We see that Cobalt Strike, Mimikatz, and AnyDesk occupy their top 3 slots, regardless of fast or slow, and that's been the case for many years. We see things like scanners, network scanners, advanced IP scanner, SoftPerfect's network scanner are also in the top 5. As a matter of fact, in 2023, we saw SoftPerfect network scanner rocket to the top. So for the first time, it displaced Cobalt Strike as the most used tool. Now, tools like network scanners are frequently used and abused by attackers, and their prevalence kind of shifts over time, but they remain fairly constant in the long run, meaning they remain in the top 5. Usually one of them will be there over time. Now, file transfer tools like WinSCP and rclone are the ones that round out the top 5, so the data exfiltration type tools. And it would appear that the easier to use WinSCP is closer to being used in more of the fast attacks than, let's say, in the slow attacks where rclone is being used, which is a more complex tool to use. And then the final two comparisons we see Lulbins and techniques. So again, everything down here is pretty much run-of-the-mill, what we would expect. RDP is used no matter what. We see some slight variations, but basically everything here is within statistical variability. When we look at the top 20 tools in either fast or slow attacks, 90% of them occur in both lists. Same can be said for things like dwell time of techniques, right? Now we're looking at things like that aren't actually measurable very easily, but things like valid accounts and browsing the network and disabling protections we talked about. There's an overlap of 80% in both the fast and slow attacks here. If we focus very quickly on the fastest 5 in this data set, we can see that there were 18 attacks that happened in less than 24 hours. And this is really quick, but there's still time to do something about this. In the fastest attack, which was a Royal attack, it took 35 minutes for Royal to find the data and steal it. So between, if we take that away from the hour and 45 minutes, there was still an hour and 10 minutes after the exfiltration where these guys could have been detected and evicted from the network. And one conclusion that we can draw from these fast buys attacks is that a lot of the groups responsible have had a lot of practice. Like I said, Black Basta, Black Bite, Royal are all part of the very same family tree. They go back to the very earliest days of ransomware. Even Lockbit, for example, which has been in the news lately, has been observed using some of Conti's code from after the leaks of 2022, the Conti leaks. So they say, practice makes perfect, and obviously these guys have been practicing for a very long time. Now, Kira, I've also highlighted here because it became the one ransomware group that was second place in our attribution list of all ransomware this year. So Lockbit was number 1, followed by Akira, and that was the fastest of a new type of ransomware that we saw enter the top 5. Now, it doesn't take much for water to do damage. Only a small crack will do, and cyber criminals are very opportunistic and will exploit anything they can. There's an old saying in InfoSec that the criminals only need to be right once and the defenders need to be right all the time. But I think that's a bit outdated. I think in reality, when cybersecurity is done well, cyber criminals have to be right every time, and we only need to detect them once. So why is it important to know all of this? Well, knowing where the attackers are helps us meet them head on, and it gives us an opportunity to fight back. Now, to turn the attackers' behaviors against them, we have to increase friction. We have to make it more difficult to do what they want to do. And if your systems are well maintained, attackers will have to do more to subvert them. That takes time, and it increases that detection window for you. Now, fancy techniques like bringing your own vulnerable driver attacks they're 4th or 5th in line after everything else has failed, and they need to go the nuclear option. So robust layered defenses, including things like sturdy protections and monitoring, that equals friction. It increases the skill level the attacker needs to bring to the table, and many simply just won't have what it takes, and they'll move on to an easier target. We must also protect everything. Not only does protection provide a chance at prevention, but it also comes with much, much needed telemetry. If an asset cannot be protected, it has to be isolated, and access to it has to be tightly controlled and monitored. Simply just foregoing protection for fear that it may adversely affect your performance, it's not the answer. And ignoring or papering over gaps in protection layers leaves the attack surface open. Now, complete telemetry eliminates deliberate blind spots, but also acts as a beacon for when blind spots are created by attackers. A telemetry signal going dark is an event that has to be investigated. And monitoring extends beyond the network and operating systems to understanding when a specific event is rare and sinister. For example, registry changes are often used by attackers to modify systems into a more compliant state and subvert their protections or hide their activity. Such changes should be rare on servers and should always be evaluated as a potential threat indicator. An integral part of monitoring beyond proactively looking at the telemetry is understanding what the information means. Many organizations collect vast amounts of telemetry, but struggle to pick out relevant or important signals. This is where experienced threat hunters and later incident responders come in. Threat hunters understand the business. They know what normal looks like, and they're on top of all the dirty tricks that attackers have at their fingertips. And together with incident responders, they know how and when to initiate a response. Being ready to investigate can mean the difference between cleaning up a pesky coin miner or rebuilding the entire environment from backup. That said, response plans for all attack types are required, and you need to practice those plans in advance with both your security practitioners and all the company stakeholders that you'd need to rely on in a crisis. This process, it's going to help you identify and address any system weaknesses before the attackers do. Many of our Sophos incident response investigations start after an organization's have attempted their own recovery and failed. And we're not saying that those companies did it wrong, because that is actually a signal that those organizations need help in the first place. And in short, what have we learned from looking at the fast and slow attacks? What have we learned from looking at all the attacks in 2023? Whether fast or slow, it doesn't much matter. Other than speed, there's no tangible difference between fast and slow attacks. And as we can see, between 22 and 23, as I shared at the beginning, the landscape has very much stabilized in terms of the types of attacks and the tools. And so it may sound like we're advising defenders to give up. We're not. Instead, we're saying, let's set aside the idea that attack speed makes a defender's job different. We're saying that the protections you have today can actually be used to make an attacker's need for speed a weapon against the attackers. And we know that where there's urgency, there's error, and attackers' speed is likely to make them noisier. And if the defenders are listening at the hands-on level of those signals, they won't go to waste. So in the immortal words of the Godfather of Soul, if you stay ready, you ain't got to get ready. If you'd like more information about the reports that were provided, the data where these reports were, were gathered from, so there's QR codes to the 3 reports from last year. As I said, the threat report is coming out next week, and the 2024 active adversary report will be published in about a month. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll pass it back to you, Rui.
Thank you, John, for this very interesting presentation. Before you go, I would like to ask you to wrap it up. Let's say it. What can we learn from studying the attackers?
Yeah, so I gave some tips at the end there, and I think the overall learning, and something that I'll be sharing in the next report, is just that we're kind of fighting yesterday's battles with all of these. So when things start to stabilize, when dwell times and attack types stabilize, when the types of tools and the root causes stabilize, it means that the attackers have found something that works. And we know very well from looking at this over time that the attackers don't innovate unless they have to. And so when I say we're fighting yesterday's battle, what I mean is that we have solutions to a lot of these problems. For compromising credentials, simply having multi-factor authentication could potentially make half of those attacks go away. Patching our systems in a timely manner, or not exposing them to the internet, as we see very often, much more with RDP than with a lot of other systems. Obviously web servers are exposed, but taking those off the internet, putting them behind a VPN with MFA would make those problems go away as well. And so we're not keeping up our defenses. I think it's time that we really critically look at what it is that we're doing and how we can have a greater effect on the attackers is by taking away the easy routes, making them work harder, making them noisier, and therefore we can actually make the dwell time go to 0. They can't, right? The faster we detect them, the shorter that dwell time is, the better the outcomes will be.
John, thank you once again. This is all from you. Thank you. Vou voltar para português. E vamos agora ter aqui um pequeno debate, algumas questões, tanto para a Bernardete da Sophos, como para o Marcelo Viegas do INL. Ahm, para começar este pequeno debate, eu queria perguntar à Bernardete, como é que o aumento dos ataques, estão a aumentar atualmente, daquilo que vocês veem? Bernardete, creio que tem o microfone desligado.
Exato, tem
Ok,
sim.
agora
Pronto,
sim.
Rui, muito obrigada. Antes de mais, queria agradecer esta iniciativa conjunta e também agradecer ao Marcelo Viegas do INL por estar sempre disponível para apresentar as suas opiniões e experiências, também com as soluções da Sophos. Obrigada. E respondendo à pergunta do Rui, voltando aqui um bocadinho a rever o adversário ativo e o report 2023 que abrange parte de 2022 e o primeiro semestre de 2023, eu vou aqui também fazer um overall sobre as tendências e alguns comportamentos do ataque e revisitando alguns pontos que o meu colega mencionou. Portanto, nós percebemos, e também já com alguns indícios do relatório de 2024, que a tendência do ataque é aumentar, com predominância do ransomware, que ronda entre os 68% e agora os 70%, mas podemos mencionar outros ataques, como por exemplo a data exfiltration, e nestes casos até, se calhar, o número evidenciado até é mais alto do que aquilo que nós mencionamos. Em relação à forma dos ataques, começam durante, ou ocorreram durante 2023, destacamos o comprometimento dos acessos, tem o MFA, e com início no Active Directory. Contudo, falamos por vezes de ataques que ocorrem, falamos também, ou vemos os ataques que ocorrem em várias fases e com diferentes intervenientes, até que o ataque suceda, ocorra de facto, e podemos mencionar também que 91% dos ataques ocorrem fora do horário de trabalho, e sendo que 43% normalmente dos atacantes desabilitam a proteção e apagam os logs, isto para que não hajam vestígios e avaliação de experts que estão a avaliar, e portanto os atacantes são ardilosos nas suas táticas e muitos deles correm, ou os ataques ocorrem num espaço extremamente curto, em menos de 5 dias, ou mesmo, como nós verificamos, em menos de 2 horas, e por isso temos que criar a fricção e proteger tudo, como dizia o meu colega John, e ter estas estratégias bem definidas entre soluções, processos e respostas a incidentes 24 horas por 7.
Obrigado, Bernardete. Eu queria perguntar ao Marcelo, aqui no caso do INL e dentro daquilo que podem obviamente partilhar, se notam este aumento de atividade maliciosa, se sentem o número de ciberataques e se calhar mais importante do que o número, a complexidade dos mesmos, se sentem a aumentar. Marcelo?
Sim, sim. Obrigado, Rui. Primeiramente, obrigado pelo convite. É sempre um prazer tá contribuir com a nossa visão e com a nossa experiência, mas temos detectado um aumento significativo no número de ataques, não só isso, mas também na sua complexidade. Especialmente porque lidamos com projetos muitas vezes confidenciais, às vezes com países que são países que estão em conflito, ou países que são mais países asiáticos, e isso traz para nós um agravante que é lidar com ser o target do ataque. Então, nós temos que constantemente monitorizar, analisar essas tendências, especialmente baseado em reportes como esse da Sophos, não só para aprimorar as nossas defesas, mas também temos que adaptar a nossa postura de segurança e a forma como lidamos com as ferramentas que temos, conforme o necessário, conforme o tipo de ameaças e a complexidade delas.
E como é que a adoção de tecnologias emergentes está a influenciar aqui as vossas estratégias de cibersegurança?
Nós temos, e nós somos, nós normalmente adotamos várias tecnologias emergentes, mas embora elas ofereçam para nós benefícios, se pensar em benefícios em termos de inovação, em termos de eficiência, ou se pensarmos na Generative AI hoje em dia, elas também introduzem, normalmente elas trazem medidas de segurança que são mais difíceis de lidar, novas superfícies de ataque, novas vulnerabilidades, trazem um novo Shadow AI, ou seja, trazem coisas novas que antes não tínhamos que lidar. Então, temos que também investir grande parte do nosso tempo em pesquisa, em desenvolvimento contínuo, tentando antecipar quais seriam as seguranças, os riscos de segurança associados a esse tipo de tecnologias, e tentarmos ser mais proativos do que reativos na adoção desse tipo de tecnologias.
Bernardete, queria perguntar se, na vossa opinião, onde é que as organizações se devem focar para obviamente, minimizar as ciberameaças?
Bem, eu considero que as organizações, ou nós consideramos que as organizações devem estar em conformidade com as normativas do CNCS e também ter agora atenção ao NIS 2, com as novas diretivas, como também sensibilizar e formar os users. Esta é uma componente importante e cada entidade deve ser capaz de avaliar o impacto da perca de informação. Portanto, o risco é um ponto fundamental nessa questão. Para além de se protegerem, as organizações devem se proteger, devem se monitorizar e ter um plano de ação e resposta 24 horas por processo. Agora, o que é que isto quer dizer? Que as organizações devem se proteger com ferramentas que cubram toda a superfície de ataque. Estamos a falar de endpoint, firewall, e-mails, ETNA, mobile, entre outras, e que estejam estas plataformas ou estes produtos, soluções, têm que estar bem configuradas para serem eficazes, e temos de proteger tudo. A proteção não só oferece uma hipótese de prevenção, como também inclui a tão necessária telemetria, que é aqui a riqueza de poder haver uma atuação, que é a telemetria, mas esta telemetria passa também na componente de monitorização 24 horas por 7, ou seja, a capacidade de olhar proativamente para esta telemetria e de a compreender e de analisar. E depois vem o outro ponto, que é a atuação, ou seja, podermos, perante esta proteção, esta a correlação de informação, poder olhar para a mesma e poder termos uma resposta eficaz se necessária. Ou então, no caso das organizações, não terem esta ação e proteção ou processos, terem pelo menos uma cópia de backup para que lhes possa dar continuidade de negócio se ocorrer um acidente.
Marcelo, na sua opinião e com base, obviamente, na sua experiência, um serviço de gestão e detecção de ameaças permite ao Departamento de Cibersegurança dedicar-se a tarefas mais relevantes para o negócio?
Sem dúvida, Rui. Isso foi uma dos grandes desenvolvimentos que fizemos agora nos últimos tempos. É uma análise quase que é muito óbvia até. Nós somos uma equipa reduzida, nós não temos capacidade e condições de competir com o mundo de ciberameaças que temos atualmente. É como o John disse, nós temos que estar 100% do tempo alertas para defender todo tipo de ameaças que possam existir, enquanto que os atacantes só precisam estar certos uma vez. E o MDR vem desempenha para nós um papel fundamental e crucial, porque ela aumenta a nossa capacidade de cibersegurança. E isso, sem contar todas as técnicas que tem de detecção e resposta, de threat hunting, de análise, de monitorização, tempo real, e poder fazer tudo 24/7 por 365, o que é algo impensável e muito difícil para equipas reduzidas e equipas pequenas como a nossa e como o de talvez 99% do mercado português. Por isso que essa abordagem que consideramos mais proativa, permite que nós, como uma equipe de cibersegurança interna, foquemos em atividades mais relacionadas a estratégias da própria instituição, enquanto que o MDR está a fazer o seu papel na caça de ameaças e nos ajudando a detectar e responder, se for o caso, a ameaças que estejam diretamente ligadas com o nosso negócio, com o nosso trabalho.
Bernardete, quais é que são os principais benefícios que um serviço de MDR proporciona às organizações?
Bem, eu acho que o Marcelo ficou aqui um ponto essencial, é que 99% das organizações não têm a capacidade nem recursos, e por não terem recursos, não é que não sejam ou não poderiam vir a ser capazes, não têm disponibilidade, não têm tempo para adquirir o know-how necessário e, portanto, uma atuação menos eficaz, ou pelo menos poderem estar a olhar para a infraestrutura ou as plataformas 24 horas por 7. E, portanto, depois há outra componente que é, ou que nós acabamos por compreender que realmente as empresas têm uma dificuldade de abordar a cibersegurança e é preciso também nós percebermos que no passado as organizações passavam ou protegiam os acessos e a informação dos utilizadores adquirindo tecnologia, apenas soluções, e o que o serviço da MDR nos traz é capacitar as equipas existentes, ou seja, neste caso, capacitar os nossos clientes no sentido de poderem contar com equipas que são especializadas em segurança e que estão disponíveis 24 horas por 7 para monitorizar, investigar e remediar. Portanto, esta disponibilidade de poderem do serviço de MDR colaborar com as equipas da IT, no sentido de lhes dar essa capacidade alargada de monitorização 24 horas por 7, também na colaboração e partilha de conhecimentos, porque as nossas equipas, e falando das nossas equipas de MDR, é isso que também elas promovem, é a capacitação dos nossos clientes no conhecimento e dando-lhes também experiência do que é que se passa a nível dos ciberataques. Depois é a disponibilidade do reporting e telemetrias de avaliação, que são importantes para provar que estão em compliance com as normativas em vigor e aquelas que são exigidas e que mencionei anteriormente. E também se torna extremamente importante quando disponibilizamos o serviço com a nossa capacidade de incorporar diferentes soluções de diferentes players, não só as nossas, como de terceiros. E isto vai beneficiar os clientes, tanto na visibilidade, tanto na análise, na priorização das detecções das ameaças em várias superfícies de ataque. E aqui é que está o vantajoso, é adaptarmos ao contexto do cliente, darmos capacidades e permitir-lhes que eles usufruem do investimento que já têm sem terem que mudar as plataformas que hoje em dia, normalmente, quando abordamos um cliente, são inúmeras.
Obrigado, Bernardete. Eu só tenho aqui mais uma questão que gostava de colocar tanto ao Marcelo como à Bernardete. Eu começava pelo Marcelo, no entanto. Na hora de selecionar um fornecedor de cibersegurança, o que é que vocês pedem, o que é que vocês procuram? E perguntava-lhe também, ao mesmo tempo, se existe aqui alguma espécie de fornecedor ideal, digamos.
Olha, eu acho que a procura ou a escolha de um provedor de cibersegurança talvez seja das mais difíceis, porque envolve certos aspectos que normalmente talvez não sejam necessários em outros tipos de provedores, ou de providers, ou de parceiros. Mas, no nosso caso, eu posso dizer, no caso do INL, nós tivemos a procura de providers que fossem líderes de mercado naquilo que fazem. Procuramos também um vendor que tivesse uma base de clientes muito grande, porque mal detectam ou mal encontram uma ameaça num dos clientes, eles conseguem replicar esses proactive threat hunting para os outros clientes todos, o que é muito bom. E especialmente a parte da confiabilidade, né? É claro que poderíamos contratar um SOC de um parceiro local com 2 ou 3 engenheiros, mas de uma forma geral estamos a entregar as chaves da nossa casa para uma empresa e temos que ter alguma confiança no trabalho que é desenvolvido e na forma como o fazem. Sem contar a capacidade de resposta, que, claro, enquanto que um SOC que tem 2 ou 3 engenheiros tem uma capacidade reduzida, uma empresa como a Sophos, ou uma empresa de cibersegurança como essa, que tem centenas de engenheiros, que mal um cliente é atacado, para tudo, vamos atuar nesse cliente, vamos tentar recuperar, detectar e recuperar o mais rapidamente possível. Então, acho que isso traz muito valor para o cliente, traz muita segurança e conforto, para que a gente possa dormir descansado, porque no fim do dia é para isso que a gente contrata esse tipo de serviço, para que possamos estar seguros de que pelo menos o máximo está sendo feito para que possamos nos defender contra as ameaças que são constantes aí fora.
Obrigado, Marcelo. Bernardete, eu perguntava-lhe o mesmo. Vocês falam com várias organizações. O que é que as organizações pedem? E, da mesma maneira que eu perguntei ao Marcelo, se existe aqui algum fornecedor ideal.
Bem, o fornecedor ideal é o que normalmente eu diria, ideal, mas é o que normalmente atua proativamente para prevenir o risco. E caso ocorra algum incidente, esteja disponível a ajudar a qualquer hora para remediar a situação. Agora, fornecedores que sejam apenas relativos não são de todo os ideais. Portanto, é necessário, como eu dizia, para ser ideal é preciso existir equipas que possam estar disponíveis e que possam ajudar e apoiar os nossos clientes. Para uma escolha criteriosa, é frequente as organizações apoiarem-se na sua experiência, provarem também as soluções e nos seus ambientes, naturalmente, e recorreram a plataformas externas de avaliação. E nós conhecemos estas plataformas como Gartner, como G2, que avalia a parte de serviços geridos, como a parte de Mitra Attack, e não descurando a questão de Gartner com o Spear Insight, que é sempre importante nós sermos avaliados e que nós temos destaque. E ao longo de 2023, todas estas plataformas de avaliação, de alguma forma, destacaram-nos como reunindo critérios necessários para fazer face à atual dinâmica das ameaças mais avançadas. E eu diria que, neste sentido, acho que, e resumindo, é proatividade, é realmente os nossos clientes poderem provar as nossas soluções e verem a capacidade delas num contexto extremamente agressivo e tendo a avaliação das plataformas externas.
Obrigado, Bernardete. Chegamos ao fim deste nosso evento em direto. Quero agradecer a todos os leitores que estiveram desse lado a acompanhar-nos, assim como ao John e à Bernardete da Sophos e ao Marcelo do INL pela partilha das suas opiniões e da sua experiência. Em breve o conteúdo deste evento estará disponível nas plataformas da IT Security até ao final do mês, na próxima edição da IT Security. Uma vez mais, em meu nome e de toda a equipa, obrigado a todos e até à próxima.